Karen bites mall cop trying to escort her out. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The mall was alive with activity as the weekend afternoon sun filtered through the high glass windows, casting long shadows over the polished tile floors. The familiar hum of bustling crowds filled the air, a mixture of excited voices, children's laughter, the occasional clatter of shopping bags, and the soothing background music that never seemed to stop. It was the kind of Saturday that felt typical for a large indoor shopping mall, a place where families wandered from store to store, teenagers lingered by the food court, and adults hurried between shops, balancing their grocery bags or the occasional latte in one hand. Amid this tapestry of ordinary weekend chaos, one figure stood out, her loud voice slicing through the calm like a knife through butter. Karen, as she would come to be known by those who would later recount this bizarre episode, was not your average shopper. Her appearance screamed disheveled entitlement, an oversized hoodie that hung loosely from her shoulders, dark sunglasses perched atop her head even though it was well past noon, and sneakers that looked like they hadn't seen a washing machine in years. Her presence was larger than life, or at least, that was how she carried herself. As she moved through the aisles, her every step seemed to disturb the fabric of the peaceful afternoon, creating ripples of discomfort wherever she went. It wasn't just her appearance, however. It was the way she interacted with everyone around her. She was loud, demanding, and almost aggressively opinionated, speaking to anyone within earshot as if the entire mall had been built solely for her convenience. Her remarks ranged from strange complaints about the quality of the mall's air conditioning to passive-aggressive comments about the outfits people were wearing. It was obvious that Karen felt entitled to voice her dissatisfaction, regardless of how little sense it made or how uncomfortable it made those around her. People tried to avoid eye contact as she passed, but her voice echoed through the corridors, ensuring that no one could escape her verbal barrage. It wasn't long before Karen caught the attention of mall security. The first few instances were harmless enough, just someone muttering complaints to the sales associates at the clothing store or questioning the price of a coffee at the food court. But then, it escalated. She began raising her voice in front of a group of children, making derogatory comments about the mall's selection of toys and the poor taste of the gifts they were picking out. Her tirade was aimed directly at a young mother who was trying to console her crying child, and Karen's words were sharp enough to cause a tense silence to fall over the entire area. The mother, already embarrassed and flustered, tried to ignore Karen, but that only seemed to fuel her frustration. Karen's voice grew louder, now making a scene in front of the toy store's display window. By this point, the security team had started to take notice. Mall security was not accustomed to dealing with this level of disruption. Most incidents were small, and the guards were adept at handling minor infractions, an unsupervised child running through the halls, a disgruntled shopper who needed to be escorted out after a disagreement with a store employee. But Karen was something else entirely. She was persistent, like a storm that refused to be weathered, and she was starting to stir up a scene that was beginning to draw a crowd. In a moment of growing tension, a mall cop, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s named Greg, was dispatched to intervene. He had been working security in the mall for several years and had dealt with more than his fair share of troublesome customers, but this felt different. When Greg approached Karen, he kept his tone calm, his body language open and unthreatening. He had seen this before, people who simply needed to be removed from the premises to restore order, and the quicker and more tactful that was done, the better. "Excuse me, ma'am," Greg began, his voice steady as he stood a few feet away from Karen, attempting to gauge her reaction. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. You've been harassing other shoppers, and it's causing a disturbance." Karen, who had been ranting about the inadequacy of the mall's customer service, immediately stopped mid-sentence. She turned her head slowly, her eyes narrowing as they landed on Greg. For a moment, she said nothing, and Greg had hoped for the best, that she would simply gather her things and leave. But instead, she snorted in disbelief, her lip curling in disdain. "Harassing shoppers," she spat, her voice laced with venom. "I'm not harassing anyone. I'm simply speaking the truth. This place is a joke. You think I'm going to just walk out like some common criminal? I have rights." Her words were punctuated by the heavy thud of her boots as she planted her feet firmly on the ground, a stance that signaled her readiness to fight back. Greg, keeping his cool, reiterated his request, but Karen wasn't hearing any of it. She had already launched into a tirade about how the mall was oppressing her, and the situation was beginning to spiral out of control. As the tension built, the eyes of nearby shoppers began to linger. Some looked nervously at each other, exchanging silent glances. Others subtly took out their phones, anticipating a viral moment that could easily make the rounds on social media. A few passers-by mumbled under their breath, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating drama, but no one was brave enough to intervene. Greg's patience was wearing thin, but he held his ground. "Ma'am, I'm asking you politely to leave now, or we'll have to involve the police." His words were measured, firm but without anger, as he took a step closer to Karen, trying to guide her toward the exit. Karen's eyes flickered with defiance, her posture now tense. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as she took a step back, and suddenly, with no warning, she lunged toward him, her hands reaching out in a frenzied motion. In a moment of pure chaos, Karen sank her teeth into the flesh of Greg's arm. The sharp pain caught him off guard, and for a split second, Greg could only react in disbelief. His arm throbbed as Karen's grip tightened, her breath hot and frantic against his skin as she continued to bite down. Her eyes were wide, filled with fury, as she screeched, "I'm being oppressed by fascists. You can't do this to me." The crowd gasped, some took a step back, others stepped forward to record the surreal turn of events, and the entire situation felt like it was spiraling out of control. What had begun as a routine request to leave the premises had exploded into a full-blown altercation, and the mall suddenly felt much smaller than it had before. The scene in the mall had transformed from a mundane Saturday afternoon to an escalating circus of chaos, and the crowd around Greg and Karen could feel the tension in the air like an electric charge. The biting moment, so unexpected and raw, sent ripples of discomfort through the onlookers, but the worst was yet to come. Karen's ferocity, seemingly born out of nowhere, had left Greg momentarily stunned, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Her teeth had dug into his arm with an alarming intensity, her eyes wild, and her protests growing louder, more frantic. He could feel her body tremble with anger, the adrenaline surging through her as if she were fighting a battle that only existed in her mind. "I'm being oppressed by fascists," she shouted, her voice breaking with the weight of her words. It wasn't just a cry for attention, it was the declaration of a war, one she had chosen to fight in the most bizarre of ways. As Greg recoiled, instinctively pulling his arm away from Karen's iron-like grip, a sharp wave of pain coursed through his limb. The blood was already starting to trickle down, and it wasn't just physical pain he felt, it was the overwhelming sensation of having lost control over the situation. His heart rate quickened, and his mind began to race as he fought to regain composure. He had trained for moments like this: conflict resolution, diffusing tension, removing disruptive individuals without resorting to violence. But nothing in his training had prepared him for someone who would respond to authority with such unbridled aggression. He realized he needed to act fast, before the situation got any worse, before someone else got hurt, or before Karen's delusional tantrum reached its peak. He called out for backup, his voice sharp and commanding despite the pain now seeping into his thoughts. "I need assistance, now." His words sliced through the mall's ambient noise, cutting through the shocked murmurs of the crowd that had gathered to watch. The crowd had grown larger, some leaning in to get a better view, others pulling out their phones in an instinctive response to the drama unfolding. People love a spectacle, after all, especially when it involved a bizarre altercation that seemed to come straight out of a viral video. Karen, however, was oblivious to the growing audience, lost in her fury, her hand still clutching Greg's arm with a desperation that belied the situation's absurdity. As Greg tried to back away, his arm still trapped in her grip, Karen began to lash out more violently, her voice climbing to a fever pitch. "You think you can just control me? You're all the same. Fascists, every one of you." Her words were like a mantra she had repeated to herself 1,000 times, a justification for her actions. It didn't matter that she was in the wrong. It didn't matter that her aggression had completely disrupted the entire mall. What mattered was that in her mind, she was the victim, and Greg was the villain. It was a twisted narrative, one that she clung to desperately as her temper flared. A few of the bystanders who had been hesitating to step in now began to shift uneasily, some murmuring under their breath about the absurdity of the scene, others cautiously glancing at the exits as if they were ready to flee at a moment's notice. The majority of the crowd stood there, watching with morbid curiosity, unsure of how to react to the unfolding nightmare. Meanwhile, the mall's security team had begun to filter in, 2 more officers, rushing to the scene with practiced urgency. They were a mix of emotions. One officer looked shaken, likely unsure of how to deal with a situation spiraling so far out of control, while the other, a veteran of many crowd-related incidents, kept his eyes on the scene with cold determination, clearly ready to take charge. Greg, still in the throes of the initial shock, realized that his initial approach had failed miserably. He had tried to handle the situation with calm and professionalism, but Karen was simply not receptive to reason. He could see that now, and it was time to get her under control, before this spiraled into something much more dangerous. "Ma'am, please, let go of me now," he said, his voice firm, though the sharp pain in his arm made it harder than he cared to admit. But Karen wasn't listening. Instead, her grip tightened, and she pulled him closer to her, her body pressing up against his in an aggressive manner. "No! You're taking away my freedom," she screamed, her face flushed with rage as she jerked her head back, causing her messy hair to fly around her face. Greg's other arm moved to break free, attempting to push her away without causing harm, but the action only made Karen more hysterical. "Help!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with the intensity of her demands. "Somebody help me! They're trying to arrest me for nothing. This is America. I have rights." Her frantic words were no longer even attempting to make sense. They were a chaotic jumble of grievances and personal delusions, flying off her lips like bullets in an out-of-control rant. The second officer, a tall woman with short-cropped hair, reached Greg's side, her hand on her radio as she called for backup. "We need more security down here. Now." She glanced at Karen with a mixture of disbelief and pity before locking eyes with Greg, who was clearly struggling with the situation. He nodded, his face grim as he wiped the sweat that had gathered on his brow. The woman stepped forward, her approach calculated but firm. "Ma'am, you need to calm down. We're not here to hurt you, but we need you to cooperate." Her voice was steady, professional, and Greg could see the officer trying to talk Karen down. But Karen wasn't having it. In that moment, Karen let out another high-pitched scream that cut through the already tense air, drawing the attention of every shopper in earshot. "I said no," she shouted, her voice brimming with unhinged defiance. It was as if she truly believed that she was fighting a grand ideological battle rather than simply being asked to leave a mall. Greg could see that this was going to take more than just words to resolve. He motioned to the veteran officer, who took immediate action. With a swift, practiced move, the veteran officer reached out and grabbed Karen's arm, forcing her to release her grip on Greg. Karen kicked and flailed, her shoes slamming against the polished floor as she fought against their hold. Her screams only intensified, becoming more guttural and primal, a cacophony of rage and frustration. As the 2 officers struggled to secure her, Karen managed to break free for a brief moment, only to be pinned down once again by the veteran officer. The surrounding crowd gasped, some stepping back, others drawing even closer, drawn by the drama and the chaos. The scene had become a full-blown spectacle, with witnesses who would never forget the bizarre confrontation between a crazed shopper and mall security. As Karen was finally restrained, she continued to scream, but her words were becoming less coherent. "Fascists, you can't stop me," she ranted, her body writhing against the officer's hold. The mall was quiet except for the continued sounds of Karen's protests and the faint hum of the background music that seemed eerily out of place now. It was a surreal moment, one that was impossible to ignore. The backup arrived moments later, with more officers entering the scene, ready to take over. The situation had been contained, but it was clear that the damage had already been done. What had started as a simple request to leave the premises had escalated into a wild confrontation, one that would make its way across social media in the coming hours, sparking debate, memes, and more questions than anyone could have predicted. As Karen was escorted out of the mall, still muttering her nonsensical claims, the rest of the shoppers were left to digest what they had just witnessed, a scene that would be etched into their minds long after they'd left the mall. The aftermath of the chaos that had erupted in the mall left an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed it. As Karen was escorted out by security, her screams of injustice and oppression echoed behind her, growing faint as the mall's double doors swung shut. Inside, however, the scene remained charged with tension, a lingering sense of unease hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. The crowd, which had gathered to witness the bizarre spectacle, began to disperse, but not without lingering glances and hushed conversations. People whispered about what they had just seen, some incredulous, others shaken by the raw intensity of the confrontation. It wasn't every day that a scene like this unfolded in a public space, a woman biting a mall cop, screaming about fascism and oppression, resisting arrest with the force of a wild animal. In the midst of it all, there had been no real clarity as to what had set her off, no understandable cause behind her behavior. It was as if she had descended into a world of delusion, a world where logic and reason were irrelevant, and only her perception of reality mattered. Greg, the mall cop who had been at the center of the incident, was left standing in the middle of the chaos, his mind still trying to process everything that had just happened. His arm, now bandaged, throbbed with a dull ache from the bite, but it wasn't the pain that weighed on him the most. It was the surreal nature of the entire situation, the fact that something as mundane as a request to leave a shopping mall had spiraled into a full-blown altercation. He had dealt with unruly customers before, people who got upset over the smallest things, but this was different. Karen had not been merely upset, she had been irrational, unpredictable, and dangerously violent. What had been a routine day of enforcing mall policies had turned into something far darker. His mind kept replaying the moment when Karen's teeth had sunk into his arm, the shock and disbelief still fresh in his memory. He had known the risks that came with his job, the occasional confrontation, the unruly behavior from time to time, but nothing had prepared him for this level of aggression. In that moment, he had been caught off guard, not just physically but mentally as well. He was used to being the calm in the storm, the steady hand in the midst of chaos, but what could he have done differently? Had he missed some warning sign? Was there something more he could have said to prevent the situation from escalating so dramatically? These questions swirled around in his mind as he stood there, trying to make sense of it all. A few minutes passed, and Greg's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a few more security officers. The veteran officer who had helped restrain Karen approached him, her expression a mixture of concern and professional detachment. "You good?" she asked, her eyes scanning his bandaged arm. Greg nodded, not trusting himself to speak just yet. The adrenaline had started to wear off, leaving him feeling oddly hollow, as if his body had experienced a surge of energy that now had no outlet. The officer, sensing his disorientation, patted him on the back. "You handled it well," she said, her voice a steady reassurance. "I don't know, it just feels wrong. Like I missed something." Like this wasn't just a regular confrontation, Greg admitted, his voice laced with frustration. The veteran officer gave him a knowing look, one that seemed to say she understood exactly what he was going through. "This kind of stuff doesn't happen every day, Greg. Sometimes people just snap, and you can't always predict it. You did your job. You didn't escalate it. That's what matters." Despite her words, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that something larger had been at play here, something he hadn't fully grasped. Karen's wild behavior wasn't just about her being upset or disagreeing with mall policies. No, it felt like she was caught up in something deeper, something more ideological, a mindset that fueled her rage and made her lash out at the world around her. In the moment when she had bitten him, Greg had seen a glimpse of that, her eyes wide with a kind of fanaticism, her voice shaking with indignation, as though the entire weight of her beliefs had collided with the simple act of being asked to leave a store. What had she meant by calling him a fascist? Had she been protesting against the very authority she thought he represented? Or was this just a case of someone whose worldview had become so twisted that nothing made sense anymore? The mall had quieted down after the incident, the normal hum of activity slowly returning, but it felt like the echoes of Karen's outburst were still hanging in the air. People who had witnessed the scene exchanged their own versions of what had happened, each recounting the details through their own lens of perception. Some saw Karen as the clear victim, oppressed by a system she could not control, while others viewed her as the aggressor who had simply lost control of herself. The incident was already starting to trend on social media, with videos of the confrontation circulating online, many with hashtags like #KarenVSCop and #MallChaos, as people eagerly speculated about the fascist accusations Karen had thrown out. But amid the online frenzy, the reality of the situation remained much more complicated. Greg wasn't just the victim of a random attack, he was a part of a system that, whether Karen understood it or not, was there to enforce rules, maintain order, and ensure that people followed basic social norms. What happened to Karen wasn't just a moment of personal meltdown, it was a microcosm of something much larger, something more pervasive. There were larger societal forces at play here, an undercurrent of distrust in authority, a rejection of the systems that people felt had failed them, and a sense of being unheard in a world that increasingly seemed to ignore the individual. Greg didn't have the answers, not yet anyway. But he couldn't ignore the fact that Karen's outburst was symptomatic of a larger cultural climate, one in which authority figures were seen less as protectors and more as adversaries, a perception that made situations like this one all the more volatile. And then there was the irony of it all. Karen had accused him of being a fascist, of trying to oppress her, when in reality, he was just doing his job, asking her to leave because she had disrupted the mall's peaceful atmosphere. The more Greg thought about it, the more he realized that Karen wasn't just fighting him, she was fighting a system that she had convinced herself was out to get her. The mall continued its usual rhythm, shoppers moved through the aisles, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded only moments ago. But for Greg, the echoes of the confrontation lingered. His arm hurt, but it wasn't the physical pain that weighed on him. It was the unsettling realization that what had started as an ordinary day in the life of a mall security guard had turned into a window into something far more complex, far more troubling. He could hear the voices of the other officers as they wrapped up the situation, and the conversations around him began to settle. Karen was gone, but her outburst had left its mark on everyone. The questions remained unanswered. How did a simple mall visit escalate into an outburst of such irrational violence? What drove her to this point? As Greg walked away from the scene, his mind raced, the sense of unease still gripping him. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. In the days that followed the chaotic confrontation, the ripples of Karen's outburst spread far beyond the walls of the mall, touching nearly everyone who had witnessed or been affected by it. Greg, the mall cop, found himself haunted by the incident, replaying the details over and over in his mind, trying to dissect the surreal sequence of events, looking for any clues that might have signaled the escalation. But the more he thought about it, the more it seemed that there had been no clear warning, no single moment where he could have predicted what was to come. The raw aggression that had poured from Karen was inexplicable, a perfect storm of delusion, fear, and anger, and it left him questioning not just his own actions, but the world he was a part of. The mall, for its part, had returned to its usual rhythm. The security team made adjustments to their procedures, tightening up protocols for handling similar situations, but in the end, life had moved on. The people who had witnessed the confrontation, shoppers, employees, and other security officers, had either forgotten about it or quietly whispered about it to their friends and families, as these things often go. But Greg couldn't forget. He couldn't shake the feeling that something larger, something cultural, had been exposed in that moment. Karen's meltdown wasn't just an isolated incident. It was symptomatic of a growing disconnect between people and the systems they once trusted, a disconnect that had been bubbling beneath the surface for years. The viral videos of Karen's outburst continued to circulate online, spawning memes, jokes, and debates. The hashtags #KarenVSCop and #FascistKaren trended for days, with people making light of the situation and others attempting to dissect the meaning behind her claims of oppression. Some found the whole thing laughable, a perfect example of a person who had lost touch with reality, while others saw it as a sign of something much darker, a growing disillusionment with authority and a pervasive sense of injustice that had taken root in pockets of society. Greg wasn't sure where he stood on that spectrum. His role in the incident had been clear enough. He had been simply trying to do his job, trying to maintain order in a public space. But he could sense the undercurrent of tension that had fueled Karen's rage, and he wondered whether the world was changing in ways he hadn't fully grasped. As for Karen, her name became synonymous with the incident, a symbol of the kind of radical defiance that seemed to be sweeping across the country. She was identified in the media as a self-proclaimed victim of systemic oppression, a person who had chosen to fight back against what she saw as an overreach of power. Interviews with her friends and family revealed that she had always been outspoken and confrontational, someone who rejected authority at every turn, but no one had expected her to lash out in such an extreme way. Some described her as a kind of martyr, someone who believed she was standing up for the disenfranchised, while others saw her as nothing more than a product of her own delusions, someone who had convinced herself that she was being persecuted by an invisible force. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. Greg, still reeling from the incident, had his own thoughts on the matter, but he couldn't share them with anyone. His colleagues at the mall asked how he was doing, but they were mostly concerned about the physical pain, the bite that had left a mark on his arm. He smiled through the discomfort and reassured them that it wasn't a big deal. But in reality, it was the emotional toll that lingered with him the most. He had seen people angry before, he had handled situations where tempers flared and words were exchanged, but nothing had prepared him for the intensity of Karen's eruption, for the almost feral energy that had seemed to take over her body when she lashed out at him. It was as if she had become a different person, driven by a force that was both familiar and foreign, a reflection of something much larger than any individual moment. The incident, as it turned out, was a turning point for Greg. He spent hours reflecting on his role as a security guard, considering whether his actions had been the best choice, whether he had done enough to de-escalate the situation, whether he should have handled things differently. In the weeks that followed, he became more attuned to the subtle signs of unrest in the people around him. He noticed how some people seemed to be walking through life with a chip on their shoulder, how a simple disagreement could spiral into a full-blown argument over nothing. The world felt more volatile than it had before, more unpredictable, and Greg couldn't help but wonder if the Karen incident was just one symptom of a much larger societal breakdown. It wasn't just Karen who had been affected by the confrontation. The mall itself, a microcosm of the broader world, had seen a shift in the way people interacted. There had been an uptick in complaints from customers, many of them about perceived injustices or mistreatment, often about trivial matters but always underlined by a sense of indignation. Customers seemed more easily offended, more ready to accuse anyone of wrongdoing, whether it was a minor inconvenience or a perceived slight. The mall's management had made changes, installing additional signage and emphasizing security protocols to ensure that things didn't spiral out of control again. But Greg couldn't shake the feeling that no amount of protocol could address the deeper issues at play, the growing discontent that was simmering beneath the surface of everyday life. As time went on, the conversation around the incident began to fade. People moved on to the next viral video, the next meme, the next piece of entertainment to distract them from the uncomfortable realities of the world. But for Greg, the memory of that day lingered, not just because of the bite on his arm but because of the unsettling realization that Karen had been a symptom of something far larger, something that wasn't going away anytime soon. Her outburst had revealed a deep fracture in the way people viewed authority, society, and themselves. And no one, least of all Greg, had any clear answers on how to fix it. Months later, as Greg continued his work at the mall, he couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. There was more tension in the air, more unease among the shoppers, more resistance to rules and authority. He saw people arguing over petty matters, refusing to follow simple instructions, treating the mall as if it were a battleground rather than a public space. It was as if Karen's outburst had sparked something, a larger cultural shift that he couldn't fully understand but could certainly feel. People were tired. They were angry. And they were increasingly unwilling to accept anything less than their own vision of reality. In the end, Karen's story faded from the headlines, but for Greg, it remained a constant reminder of the fragile line that separated order from chaos. He had done his job, followed the protocols, and in the end, he had come out of it relatively unscathed. But the world around him seemed to be shifting in ways that were harder to ignore, and he wondered if things would ever return to the way they had been before. As he walked through the mall one quiet afternoon, he found himself looking around, observing the people moving through the space with a new sense of awareness. The world, it seemed, was becoming a place where a simple interaction could ignite a storm, where the line between order and chaos was thinner than anyone had imagined.